Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to be learning about macroeconomics. It's the very first video in the whole class. So we're going to talk to you about big goals and also introduce one model called the business cycle. So let's get started. Okay, so this first little section just kind of tells you what macroeconomics is. It's the field of economics that concerns itself with the big, right? So we talked about at the beginning of the school year, macro meaning big. Big economics means things like country level concerns or large scale concerns, unemployment, inflation. That's the prices of everything in a whole economy, how much we're producing in the whole economy. Usually you can kind of spot macroeconomics because it's going to talk about a country or it's going to talk about a large group of people. It's going to be more than just one particular market. It'll be the markets for a whole bunch of different things, right? It might be all across the country or even around the world. So big economics, right? When we talk about macroeconomic goals, we're really saying, like, as a society, like, what do we want in terms of our big economy? What are the big goals? And the big goals are increasing economic output. That's probably the most important one. And that's the first one that we're going to learn about when we talk about GDP, is how we measure it's how we measure economic output, but we want more of it. And I'll kind of get later into the weeds about why. The second thing we want is stable and low unemployment. And that means that we're fully using our resources as a society, right? We don't want lots of ups and downs with that, but we also kind of want it to be a low level. Third, we want stable, low increases in price levels. And this is a little bit maybe controversial to some folks to say we want there to be an increase in price levels. But what we're really saying here is that we want it to be a little bit more than zero. We'll come back and talk about why we don't want prices just to stay exactly the same, because there's some risk involved actually in that. But we'll come back later and kind of explore that. But what we really don't want is instability. Right? You can see here, stable. We want something where it's nice and predictable. That's a key economic thing that we want in terms of big economies, because stability allows us to plan and it allows us to make investment decisions that are going to ultimately grow and make people's lives better. So predictable, right? That's the goal. We don't like unpredictable things. Black swan events are bad. So let's talk about this first model of macroeconomics, and it's called the business cycle because we're going to see some ups and downs despite the stability as a goal. And what it is a model of output over time. And so we're going to have kind of a long one here. It's kind of an interesting axis, not what we're usually used to. I'm going to put T for time down there, and then I'm going to use capital letter Y up here for output. And so output equals Y, T equals time. You don't need to write output unless you really like the word output, but we're going to use the letter Y throughout the rest of this course to talk about real output, the value of the things that we are producing. And so we're going to first start with this by saying that there's going to be an upward sloping straight line. And what that represents is potential output. That's the capacity of the economy. So I'm going to also write that word capacity of output. Right. And that's the amount that we could be producing, is kind of the way to view that. Is like, imagine if we were fully using our resources, what would we be producing? And an analogous concept here is the production possibilities curve, right? We kind of drew that in last semester, but we can use a production possibilities curve in a similar way. And the curve kind of is this same idea, right? It's our potential. But what we find is that over time, output often rises and falls and rises and falls. And so the actual level of output is going to come up and down and up and down and up and down. And it's typically not actually as pronounced as we're seeing here. Usually that's really, really small downturns and then much longer periods of what we call expansions. So there are some terms that we need to know related to these. Anytime you have decreasing output, right? If Y is decreasing, we call that a recession. And officially, a recession is actually 6 consecutive months or 2 quarters of a year where output is decreasing. And anytime you have increasing output, we call that an expansion. Expansion up here. What we would typically note is that there's kind of an association between the other economic indicators and these. So in recessions and expansions, I'm going to kind of skip down here to this, then I'll come back to talk about growth versus output. In a recession, output would fall, right? So that's always true. Like, that must be true. But what we often find, right? Often, but not always, right? So that's kind of these here. And then this is always true, right? These are often but not always true. Inflation usually will go down in a recession and unemployment will go up in a recession. And that's because typically we find that people lose their jobs in recessions because we're not producing as much output. So there's not as much being produced, and so therefore the derived demand for labor and for machines is less, and so we have layoffs. As a result of people having fewer jobs, they don't go out and buy as much stuff, which reduces the demand for all kinds of goods and services in the economy. And that typically is why prices would fall, or price levels is what that L stands for. Those would fall in a recession. In an expansion, output must always rise, right? That's the definition. And in fact, at any time output is rising, you know you're in an expansion. Inflation is going to increase because unemployment will typically fall. And so these are kind of linked economic indicators, unemployment and inflation. They're usually going opposite directions. We'll talk about later in the class about when they're going the same direction, and that could be a really bad thing or it could be a really good thing. But obviously, if you have high inflation, really high prices, and high unemployment, that's the worst of both worlds, right? That's the worst possible thing. But we'll get to those later in this class. But at the beginning, we just kind of walk before we run. The last thing we want to talk about in terms of introducing macroeconomics is that we need to make a distinction here between potential and actual. And increasing output just is an economic expansion, right? That just means we're producing more stuff. But economic growth is a really key concept in this class, and it is actually the increase in capacity, right? So we kind of have this connection, and you can see economic growth because at the start of this time period, T period 0, the capacity of the economy was that much. At, let's say, this time period, the capacity of the economy was way up here. And so from here to here over time, the economy saw economic growth. And during that same time, we had an expansionary phase, we had a recession, and then we had more expansion, but the potential increased. And that's actually what economic growth is. Now, there's some pretty simple recipe to create economic growth, but we care about it a lot in economics because it's what we use to measure is the typical person's life getting better? Is their standard of living rising? So that's why we care about it. The typical way that we increase it is through more productive inputs, right? If your workers and your machines become more productive, you're going to have more productive capacity, and so you would have more growth. Another way to do that is to increase capital. And this could be human or physical. And both of these would improve the productivity actually of your inputs. And so these are kind of really two ways of saying the same thing. And in increasing capital, whether it be human capital, the quality of your workers, or more tools and machines and factories, which is what physical capital is, that's going to lead to more productivity of your inputs. And therefore, you're going to be able to produce more stuff, right? So economic growth distinct from just increasing levels of output. Hopefully this helped you make sense of the business cycle and some basic macroeconomic goals. I'll see you next time.